Let's do a quick recap. Consider the characteristics of your piano, the sound of it. Mellow, is it rich? Is it kind of a bold sound? Is it kind of a weak sound? Is it dry? Is it very affected? Is it an algorithmic piano, like piano tech, very mathsy? Or is it a multi-sample piano, like lab soft piano, anything by Spitfire, something you're gonna find in Contact or a sound font, something like that? Because that makes a difference. Does it have few or many velocity layers? That shows how dynamic you can play it, loud, soft, whether you're gonna have to automate things later on for the volume wise. When you're gonna process it, for the context of drum and bass, you're gonna have to scoop out a lot of the mid-range and get rid of a lot of resonances. You can do that with EQs, just basically stack them one after another, kind of highlighting specific ranges. Broad strokes EQ for shape and color, and specific EQ for resonances and peaks. Every piano will be different, especially if it's sampled. You're going to get a lot of weird quirks that are specific to the piano that's being sampled. That's all just things to think about when going into processing the piano, but it doesn't mean you have to necessarily do all or any of it. It's very much a case by case basis. But again, this is more of a starting point and then a little clue into how I would do it and why I would do it within the context of my own tracks and my own sound that I'm going for. Okay? So what's up? Today, in this video, whenever this is, we're going to talk about processing pianos and some things that I do, and some things you should look out for, some things to consider, all that good stuff when doing it, because it's a tricky instrument, especially when you're trying to, fit it within a drum and bass context. There's so much going on. Like, piano's like one of those instruments you could spend all the time you want on it and it still won't work. Or you could spend no time on it and just, it still won't. You know what I mean? It's difficult. So I think we can talk about it. It's one of the things I think I do well with, yet it's a whole long process. I'll try and simplify into little points for you to branch off from. But to give you a basic start, we're just going to talk about treating pianos and some other things that made any sense. I'm not going to edit that out. Let's just go for it. Anyway, so when picking a piano or when starting off with piano sound, I think it's a good thing to, first of all, consider the sound of it. What does it sound like? Is it a soft piano? Does it have like a kind of a soft lessened attack, kind of like felt pianos do? The Spitfire soft piano is a felt piano. You got double felt pianos, cotton, other different kinds, like the hammers on the strings. That sound, is it, because that'll alter the timbre, that'll alter how resonant it sounds and a whole bunch of other different characteristics. So that's one thing to consider. Like, is it mellow sounding? Is it very rich? Is it kind of dry of a sound? Not a lot of resonance, not a lot of reverb baked into the sound, things like that. Some things you'll come across, is it like an algorithmic piano, or is it a multi-sample piano? So like an algorithmic piano is something going to be like the plug-in piano tech, where, through math, it models the sound of a piano. But a sample, like a multi-sample piano, will be anything you find in like Contact, any of the Spitfire instruments, the lab soft pianos, multi-sampled. You record an actual piano with mics, and then you do all these things. They have different velocity layers, things like that. That also is something to take into account, because sometimes they're not as flexible as you would like, because like their purpose is not to fit into a drum and bass mixdown. It's to completely recreate a piano sound and fit in film scores and things like that, where everything doesn't necessarily have to be as like treated so analytically, so it's something to consider. Another thing is it's like baked in level of like reverb, resonances, delays, any other kind of effects. If you can get a completely dry sound without a lot of reverb, that's usually the easiest to work with, because you can add a reverb later on through sends and things like that, and that should help. All right, so one of the things you're gonna have to consider when you're starting to process the piano is that it's a very full range instrument. If you look at the spectrometer, it's always going to hang around that 200 to 500. That's going to be the bulk of your sound. Even if you go up to the top, that's a little bit, but it's got that body that will make it difficult to fit within a drum and bass mix down. And if you've dealt with pianos at all, you realize you probably have to scoop all that mid-range out. Not completely, but in order to balance it, still get the intelligibility of that 1 to 2K range and above, but not have that crazy resonance in the middle. And when you add pedal into it, you would go from add a pedal, even more resonance. And the more you play, and then this is where it gets in like playing technique and pedaling and voicing, you start building up more mid-range, more resonance. So let's just listen to what I have here. So nothing too busy. It's fairly reserved in its range. It's staying around the same octave. You can see when it's playing. Definitely, there's a peak in that 200 hertz range, and you can just see it going down. And to add even more, I have the sound I want. I like the sound. It's playing with the pedal. So without the pedal, let me find the notes. That's octave up. Without the pedal, it's more of a finite sound. It's not as resonant. It's a bit drier because it's not holding that pedaled sound down. But if I add the pedal in now, okay, I played the wrong note, but you see how it holds that sound. It's more resonant in that mid-range. And that brings up the idea of you can negate that resonance with how you play. See, if I played this, it's pretty open voicing. If we look at piano roll, this is fairly open for the chord. So like that's pretty spread out. But what if I, brought it down to just, what am I switching out? Or I brought it in to like, towards really, see, you can't really hear the individual notes with this, but that's the same chord, just spaced down. But what if I bring that back out? That's wrong, but now it's a bit more open, a bit more bright. So remember, you can do that instead of EQing the shit out of it in the middle, if you'd like, because it's less sound fighting for that same space, less sound waves reacting to each other, making more resonant area. So you go, that's something to consider. So how did I start processing this? So if we go into, I already process this for the sake of the track I'm building, which is about done. So, all right, roll off the low end. You really don't need, it gets rumbly. Which, this is more of a, definitely more of like a safeguard kind of thing. Roll off a bit of the noisy, airy kind of tops that you would get with like room sound, room tone. I don't really need that. If we highlight it, no, there's not a whole lot. At least I can't hear it right now, but because it's really high up there. But once you start compressing things and adding more later on, that's when it starts rearing its ugly head. That's compression in pianos are it's an interesting thing. I didn't really do it with this one because, well, here's another tip. You can compress piano sometimes depending on how dynamic you're playing it, meaning like you're playing it loud and you're playing it quietly, as quietly as you can. This one doesn't have as many velocity layers, so I'd have to automate parts of it. In the actual track I do, but you can compress pianos, or you can compress by just playing softer notes, bringing your velocity down. Yeah, that's another thing. It is an instrument that you play, or that would be played, so you don't always have to process things, but you can just play them differently, you know? Yeah, so let's go. Next EQ is a bit more of that mid-range area. Again, if you've watched any of these videos I do, I could do like a lot of EQing just in one EQ, but I like to just stack them. It doesn't take a whole lot of CPU most of the time, and each EQ usually targets a specific area, and it helps me keep track of what I'm doing relatively. So now we add that. That's on, and that's off. Now on. Yeah, and I had to change the scale. So you see it's going down. It's cutting out that mid-range, like I said, to around 200 hertz, up to 1K, 500. It's really just dipping it out. That first EQ did a bit of the same thing. That's just 1 dB down, and that really meant that mid-range. Again, third, another EQ. This brings up the richness of kind of the tops and that intelligibility around 5. This is 5.6K. So without it, you have and then turn it on. Yeah. So I like this EQ mostly because I'm not going to get as like dialed in specific frequencies. I'm more shaping the sound a bit more. So that this is bringing out like the hammer sound in that area, and kind of the felt, kind of the roomy in the piano like sound of like the mechanics of it. You can hear kind of the hiss of the room a bit more. And I am driving it just a little bit. This adds a bit of subtle saturation again, which is light compression in a way. It helps even the piano out. It helps give it a bit more character, a bit more like reinforce it a little bit to me. So yeah, so far piano with nothing. Okay, now piano with just those 3 EQs so far. Again, sounds like a lot, but it's subtle things and splitting up the task. So cleaning the mid-range, then this one to shape it a bit more. So you're starting to get less of that like really resonant body. You're starting to hear more of the character in it. All right, next. And this is like what I normally do with most pianos. And then a few things which I will point out are just like character things or things that are specific to the track I'm working on. Because I don't use the same piano for every track, but I do use kind of the same workflow to process pianos. Okay, now we got isotope vinyl, which I like to add a bit more character to it. Like this, like these things they're basically kind of like EQ curves, filters, whatever. So like the 2000 will be like nothing almost. The 1930 is like, sounds like it's coming out of a tin can if I turn the plugin on. So I do this, something just fell. Anyway, I do this again as a character thing. I just kind of play around with it. I normally do is kind of hit one of these EQ curves, usually between like the 60, the 70, or the 80. It takes some of the more that resonant mid-range out. It rolls off some of the low end and some of the tops as well, and gives it more of a warmer, kind of realistic, not realistic, more like, you know, if you sample it off a record. That's the whole point of this. But sometimes you don't want the pristine piano unless you're going for that, like, you know, liquid, the, you know, fluffy liquid sound. You can just keep the piano stock and then it sounds bad, but that's just my opinion. Anyway, then I hit the warp button a little bit. So extremes, it'll be like, so I'll just put it down there around 12%, really subtle. Adds a bit more character to it. This is like one of my go-to plugins that isn't an EQ, just to add a bit of something to the sound, you know? So yeah, so far, that's what I'm doing. All right, now, here's a new thing. The stereo image of a piano. So we're talking about algorithmic versus multi-sampled pianos. So algorithmic pianos, you can do whatever you want with the stereo image. You can kind of have notes coming out of anywhere. Sometimes it's very centered. Sometimes it feels like it's spread across both channels. Sometimes it's a mix between the two. And multi-sampled pianos, depending on how they're set up, how they were mic'd, that's the stereo image you're going to get. So you have a very close mic piano when you play in the lower octaves. And let me find the lower octave first. It's not too, you can hear it's in the left channel, because if you're looking at a piano, the low octave will be towards your left, high octave will be towards your right. And then we go top octave. Very weird. Is that me? Sounds like it's still panned to the left, so I feel like, did I mess up somewhere in this? No? Oh yeah, it's my ear, and having hearing loss in one ear. That'll do that to you. That gets me every time. But anyway, if your hearing wasn't messed up slightly, the higher parts will come up on the right channel. Now, what I do, depending on how the piano sounds by itself, I will either kind of bring it out, widen, or I will narrow the image. So like with this, I am narrowing it down, so where I'll go to the extremes on both sides, then I'll show you the middle ground that I go to. So extremes, it widens it so much that it's out of phase and it's starting to cancel out, and it sounds centered, but it's gross. And then the other way, extreme, is dead mono, and it's kind of a character thing. Sometimes I like a mono piano, sometimes I don't. And if I were to make a piano mono, I would just go back, to vinyl, click this little switch, and it'll be mono. But this helps me kind of reel it in. So dead start is, and when you turn it on, this plugin specifically, it does alter the pitch, alter the stereo image just a bit in a pleasing way. It's not going to create a lot of weirdness, but it will make it feel a bit more open. And what I'll do after that is kind of wiggle it. So that's a bit wider, that's a bit much. This is a bit more open. I feel more of a hollowness towards the inside. I might do that if I want a drum break to really pop through, or a vocal. But for this case, I reeled it in just a bit. So for me, the way I think about it is like you have like a flat soundstage. That's where it starts. And to me, it just kind of folds it in just a little bit to where it's more centered, like the piano's more in front of you. I guess if you were to mic it, like if you close mic'd it, you're right here, piano's right behind it, right behind those mics. It would be kind of like, so the image would very much like boom, boom, like the bottom halves on the left side, top halves on the right side, right? and you can really tell what's left and right. But if I scoot back, kind of further mic it away, then while they're still there, my perception of where it is changes. So now I'm away from this mic, but the correlation how it sounds. So if I mic it from further back, it won't sound as left right. So the stereo image will sound more narrow, and that's kind of what I want because I'm placing it within a mix of a bunch of other things. And if I have like a pad and a bass and a this and a that going on around it, I want to make sure the piano sits right where I want it to sit. So reeling in the stereo image is something that's very important when it comes to how you want your piano to sound within the context of a full mix. So, very long-winded way of saying that, but it's something you can always play with. Also, like we were saying earlier about the playing versus processing, if I'm playing in a specific range and not moving out of that, say I'm just playing like there and not going around, it might already be centered based off how it's mic'd with multi-sample pianos. But let's say I'm playing top end, that might end up on some pianos sounding very right channel heavy because that's where it'll come out. So you could pan that towards the center, so it has more a central sound. Otherwise, your mix might feel a bit off balance unless you're playing like up there or all over the place. Then you might not want to pan it at all, like a very wide range, because that would throw things off. So it's something to consider where you're playing in the range of piano and where the sound is coming from, left to the right. And if you want it central, which most time with pianos you do, unless it's like more of a colorful, more of an accent kind of thing, that can be anywhere, but you might want them a bit more centered. So like with this piano, I just pulled in the stereo image just a bit so it fits kind of where in the area I want it to. All right, let's move along. That was a bit long. Another EQ. Let's flip it on. Like I said, drastic, well, not really, but just you can see I'm taking out resonances now, you know, very specific things. So like low mid-range with this one, very much, this is a resonant note right here. This 200, 222, like before we added any plugins, you could see on the spectrum analyzer, that was a very resonant area. And you can hear it, and I'm taking that out. So off. Now back on. Now, if you're hearing it, because I'm hearing it as well. I'm going back through this process like, why did I do that? And so now it might sound a little sterile, a little anemic, like you're taking a lot of the body out of it. This is very much how can I fit this piano in the mix at this point? So I have like a kind of a heavy, kind of like a almost pure sine wave triangle, very saturated, but it's taking up a lot of this like 100 and below range. And then there's some pads going on as well. So once you have it sitting in a mix, it's still going to feel full, but on its own, it might feel a little empty, you know, but it's complemented by the parts that it's surrounded by. So that's something to consider. But this is more mixing, taking out resonances, making sure it fits in the mix. This is a vocal track that it came out of. So my voice kind of sits around this area it peaks around this area. So I'm making sure that it fits on top of this piano here. I guess while I'm talking now, it kind of fits. Yeah, not really. Yeah. So next, another EQ. Again, this is for shaping. A bit much, but I like to do things in stages, and like different EQs have different characteristics and qualities. Now, just to explain, you don't have to do all this with your pianos at all. Could have just EQ'd it a few times, and that could be it. Could have been it. This is very much a specific case, like I kind of outlined, specific to the track that it came out of, And it's more specific to this piano, like the instrument itself, the English classic piano from Piano Book. I might not process a lab soft piano or piano tech or any other kind of piano instrument the same way, outside of EQing to get a specific color, a shape, and to take out certain resonances and to fit it within a mix. That's all the things. But this is, at this point, like with this EQ, it's very much shaping. It's very much how I like to hear pianos, that kind of thing. So without it, now flip it on. Cleans it up a little bit in the mid-range, takes out some of the lower, around 40 hertz area, kind of curves it off a bit, 650 around there, takes out some of that mid-range again. It adds a bit of air up around, it says 20, but it's kind of a shelf around, 10, kind of up to 20K. Adds a bit of that. If I go extreme, you'll hear it. So it gets me a bit of that top end character of the felt or whatever, the string sound. And so I can hear it, and it's a bit more of that like click, the clicks and a bit of grit to it. It brings it out. It's there, but it's very low. And I'm adding noise at that point. And then from there, that's basically it, how I process it. And then it's not liquid if it isn't low passed. And that's to fit it in the mix. It's certain parts. So that is basically me processing piano. Yeah, let's hear it off. That's how I would. And then, wait, I'm skipping ahead. So that's off, and now it's on. All the plugins we just put. And again, it sounds, at this point, it's by itself, sounds a bit weak. But once it's fit into a mix, which I'll show you in a second, it makes more sense. So let's do a quick recap. Consider the characteristics of your piano, the sound of it, mellow, is it rich, is it kind of a bold sound, is it kind of a weak sound, is it dry, is it very affected, is it an algorithmic piano, like piano tech, very mathsy, or is it a multi-sample piano, like lab soft piano, anything by Spitfire, something you're going to find in Contact or a Sound Font, something like that, because that makes a difference. Does it have few or many velocity layers? That shows how dynamic you can play it, loud, soft, whether you're going to have to automate things later on for the volume wise. When you're going to process it, for the context of drum and bass, you're going to have to scoop out a lot of the mid-range and get rid of a lot of resonances. You can do that with EQs, just basically stack them one after another, kind of highlighting specific ranges. Broad strokes EQ for shape and color, and specific EQ for resonances and peaks. Every piano will be different, especially if it's sampled. You're going to get a lot of weird quirks that are specific to the piano that's being sampled. That's all just things to think about when going into processing the piano, but it doesn't mean you have to necessarily do all or any of it. It's very much a case by case basis. But again, this is more of a starting point and then a little clue into how I would do it and why I would do it within the context of my own tracks and my own sound that I'm going for. Okay. Yeah, a bit of compression, a bit of saturation helps. Always helps with any kind of mix to help even out the sound, reinforce it, give it a bit more strength and character within the mix, but it isn't always necessarily what you need to do. I don't know. That's kind of what we went to. I'll talk a bit more after we switch projects right now. All right, we switched projects. This is where the piano came out of. And I haven't done any extra processing for the in this. It's I just ripped the piano right off of it. There's a little top line here, but this is the piano of these two tracks. I got the chords on one, and there's like a top line. I'm taking it out. But let's hear it within the context of an actual track and make sure it's not going to be stupid loud. That's going to be loud. Okay. Here we go. That's the piano. It's low pass right now, but yeah. Take that off. Yep, same thing. Okay, so remember I told you on its own the piano might sound a bit sterile, but once you so again, piano on its own sounds a bit sterile, but once you add a bass in there, it fills out that low end. And it's some weird parts in there that I might have to fix because I did play it all the way through. Right, play it and loop it. Pro tip: don't just play for 6 minutes unless you want to. Just play a good chunk and then loop that. But do try and play it. It adds a lot of adds some good stuff. All right, then what else we have to help it? We got like a little pad thing I made. I played a guitar in, put it through Guitar Rig. This helps fill in some of that space that we did take out of the piano, and it makes it again feel a bit more full. And it's very subtle. Yeah. And at this point, I do have vocals going. I'm not going to show you those because it's not really into that right now. But you see how the piano was on its own, all that processing, and why I processed it a certain way so it fits. This isn't a really technical mix. It's kind of just piano and bass, some pads, that kind of thing. But I made space for the drums, pads to move around it, and for the bass to carry the low end. If you remember that, so. There's a wrong note in that guitar pad. Anyway. Okay, so for some extra things. You could layer things with the piano, again, for extra timbre, extra kind of reinforcing certain notes. Like if you check out the Mumbles of Grace walkthrough, I did it pretty heavily in that one. Highlighting specific notes, melodies, and like middle lines within the piano, but in other instruments. It always helps. Like you could layer Rhodes over piano. You can layer the piano with itself. You can bounce it out and heavily just process it in parallel, basically. If you had a piano, like an actual one around, you go just record yourself playing it and then put that in. You could bounce out this whole piano line and chop it up and sample it, again, affecting things, giving it that sampled feel, but it came from a virtual instrument for whatever sake. But really, that is it. So from the beginning of, raw piano sounding like butt cheeks, to a bit processed without the high pass. and then do a full mix. Now, as this track stands by itself, it needs a lot more work on the mix now, but yeah, that's another video for another time. Yeah, so I hope that helps. Let me know in comments. Get, you know, the usual, get in contact, and let me know if this was like stupid or if it was useful. I don't know. It is very much a starting point plus what I would do after that starting point within the context of a track I'm making. Mixing and processing is very much a context dependent thing. Sometimes, like, you could process a sound all on its own. It might sound great by itself, but as soon as you throw it in with a bunch of other sounds, it falls apart or it takes up too much, or, you know. So take that into consideration. But those initial ideas of just EQing for shape and for specific resonances, sound quality, basically, that kind of thing, start from there and experiment to find your own sound. Again, how you like to process things. It's not going to be the same across the board, but the tools that are used are usually the same. EQ, compression, saturation, blah, 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 blah. So hope that helps, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks.